Let's bring in Michael Cohen, Trump's former personal lawyer. He is the host of the Mea Culpa and Political Beatdown podcast and is the author of Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the Department of Justice Against His Critics. Good to see you, Michael. I want to get you to respond to that. So Don Jr. claiming he had no involvement whatsoever in the statements of financial condition and just relied on the accountants. Eric Trump being a little bit more squirrely on that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things that Don Jr. stated, I read in the paper, is that he was really just a broker. Now, I'm not really even sure what that means. Yeah, he may have his brokerage license here in New York, but that's not what his job entailed. Then you have Eric Trump's earlier testimony where he stated, get a load of this one, Joy, that he poured concrete. Now, I could tell you emphatically that Eric Trump has never poured concrete in his life. He probably couldn't even figure out how to make Kwikset using just the Kwikset and water in a bucket. I mean, it is so fundamentally flawed that it's comical. I mean, and I could understand Lisa Rubin's comments about the tale of two brothers. It was more of a comedy than anything.
You know, the other piece of it is that, you know, you had another confrontation with the judge over his clerk and this sort of seeming obsession that Donald Trump and one of his lawyers, Chris Kise, has with this clerk. What do you make of the fact that we know that the first part of this case is over? They've already been adjudicated guilty of fraud. All the judge gets to decide how much they have to pay. What do you make of the fact that they don't seem to be understanding that pissing this judge off is a bad idea?
Yeah, well, Chris Kise, there's something very seriously wrong with him. He attacked me vociferously when I was on the stand, getting up, calling me all sorts of. That's all that they do is they know how to denigrate. It's not going to bode well for him. It's about the last thing that you want to do, especially when your co-counsel messed up and failed to, check the box for the jury trial. Hence, of course, why it's a bench trial right now. So before you want to sit there and attack, even after the judge has now sanctioned Trump twice and placed the gag order onto him, all they're really doing is playing to a party of one. And how many times have I said this to the public, to those people who are MAGA supporters, whether it's MAGA supporters who are members of Congress? Look at what happened to me. I promise you, the same thing is going to happen to you if you don't wake up and extricate yourself from the cult. All Chris Kise is doing is playing to a party of one. Why? I have no idea.
Yeah, and to your point about the cult, and the big lie is the center of it. We've seen now that members of Congress really have to just get out of Congress if they're Republicans and they don't accept the big lie. But there's an interesting thing that's come out through this trial. Donald Trump Jr.'s cross-examination. Prosecutors presented a document dated January 15, 2021 that showed the former president reinstating himself as trustee of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. Full control of Trump's trust would have been returned to the former president on January 20, 2021, the day he left the White House. That means he knows he lost, right?
Well, it sure sounds like that. Otherwise, why would he, sign that document to take control back? Obviously, he knows that if you are the president of the United States, and if he really thought that he won and that there was a legitimate challenge, he certainly wouldn't be asking to take back control, because if in fact he was right, well, then he would have to go ahead and redo the documents all over again, transferring the authority again to Don Jr. and to Eric and to Alan Weisselberg as the trustee. So it clearly shows that he knew that he lost. Why he ended up, again, there's no thought when it comes to this group. They just do things, and then afterwards, when confronted, what do? Exactly what they accuse everyone else of doing. They deflect and they lie.
Let me also talk about Donald Trump's demeanor here at this point. I think it's clear that this case is enraging him because it is about his money. When there's an excerpt from Jonathan Karl's book on Trump's outburst at his lawyer, Todd Blanche, one of his attorneys, when the judge announced the court date of March 25, 2024. And I think this is actually in the case about the insurrection. He screamed at him, this is going to be in the middle of the primaries. If I lose the presidency, you're going to be the reason. We've also had Trump talking about I'm your retribution and that kind of thing and that kind of reaction to things. Steve Bannon, one of his aides, has said that he couldn't stop touting Trump saying that, referring to it as his come retribution speech. Come retribution, according to some Civil War historians, served as the code words for the Confederate Secret Service's plot to take hostage and eventually assassinate President Lincoln. The escalating rhetoric, in your view, what does that bode for us?
Well, look, I've often said, and I'm going to say it again on your show tonight, so hopefully people pay attention. You must listen to what Donald Trump says. He's not just speaking, boldly and blindly. He's telling you exactly what's on his mind. Probably foolish, but he is telling us what's on his mind, and more importantly, what he intends to do. So when he says that on day one, if he wins, he's going to rewrite the Constitution, he's not joking. He thinks that he can rewrite the Constitution. And if somehow, because of all of the sycophants that are there, he manages at least to delay or to get a hold of the full power of the United States government by taking the power away from the judiciary and the legislator and conveying it upon the executive branch. I'm telling you, that's what he thinks he can do. And that's what he will try to do. He is by far the single most dangerous thing to happen to American democracy, maybe in the United States history.
How much more dangerous does he become if he loses a large chunk of his wealth due to this trial?
You know what? I think more important than that is what happens if he loses the election again. Because, look, I've often said that one of the things that Donald will do is he's a copycat. He likes strongman. We know this. We like likening to the fact of the relationship with Mohammed bin Salman, with Kim Jong-un, with Vladimir Putin. What do I think that he'll do? I think he'll end up copying. And I know this sounds hyperbolic, but it's not. This is actually what I truly believe, knowing him as well as I do, that he will try to do, or he will attempt to do, exactly what Mohammed bin Salman did when he grabbed all of the other royals and took, I don't even know, $150 billion from them. That'll be nothing compared to what Trump will do to folks like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, the Waltons. I mean, he will go to each and every one of them, and he will take from them the bulk of their assets. And if you think that this is something he's not going to try or he's not thinking about, you'd be wrong. It's exactly what he's thinking, that overnight he will be the richest man in the world. He'll just say to Elon Musk, I know you think you're worth $300 billion. I'm going to let you keep one, but you're signing over the other 299 to me. That's how strongmen work.
Yeah, it is certainly what Vladimir Putin did as well. Scary stuff, but scaring is caring, as we say on this show. Believe what your eyes are telling you about this man.
Exactly.
Michael Cohen, thank you as always. Much appreciated.